Family disappears. Mystery. 9 years later, police discover truth after a man walks into a local cafe. It was a crisp October evening in 2020 when the small town of Ruinerwold, tucked away in the rural countryside of the Netherlands, first became entangled in a mystery that would shake the local community to its core. Ruinerwold was a place where everyone knew everyone else. Life moved at a gentle pace, and little ever seemed out of the ordinary. But on that night, the atmosphere in the quaint de Castelline Café shifted. Something unexplainable was about to unfold. The sun had long set, and the dim glow of the café's lanterns flickered against the windows, casting a warm yellow light onto the cobbled streets outside. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and Dutch pastries wafted in the air. Inside, a handful of regulars sat by the fireplace, sipping their drinks and chatting idly. It was the kind of place where you could feel the weight of history in the air, where time seemed to slow down and the mundane felt comforting. But that evening, a strange figure stepped through the door, a young man, thin, disheveled, and strangely out of place. His eyes were shifty, not meeting anyone's gaze, and his body language screamed discomfort. He walked slowly towards the bar, dragging his feet, as if he was unsure of what he was doing there. He ordered 5 pints of beer in quick succession, and consumed them at an alarming speed, almost without taking a breath. The regulars watched in stunned silence, exchanging puzzled glances. No one knew who he was, and that was odd, in a town as small as Ruinerwold. Even visitors were often familiar faces, or at least they were known by the locals. This young man, however, was completely unknown. As the bartender set the 5th pint before him, the man gave a weary, defeated sigh. He downed the last one in a single gulp and wiped his mouth, his hands trembling slightly. Then, without saying much more, he sat down at a corner table. The room was filled with an uncomfortable silence, the kind that only a stranger can bring into a small town. Chris Westerbeek, the owner of de Castelline, watched the man from behind the bar, his curiosity piqued. There was something unsettling about the way the young man carried himself, like someone who was trying to hide something, or perhaps running from something. And yet, despite the unease in the air, Chris had seen enough strange characters in his time to dismiss the thought. But this time, something felt different. The young man's silence only deepened the mystery. His presence was almost as though he was a ghost from another world, out of sync with the small town rhythm of Ruinerwold. It was unusual for anyone to stay silent in a place like this, where everyone prided themselves on knowing each other, where a friendly word was always exchanged between strangers and locals alike. But this man, he said nothing. He just stared down at the table, avoiding any attempt at conversation. An hour passed, and just when Chris thought the strange visitor might leave, he returned for more beer. The regulars, now slightly more intrigued and suspicious, whispered among themselves. A few of them considered approaching the man, but his odd demeanor made them hesitate. Was he drunk? Was he just lonely? Or was something more sinister going on? As the night dragged on, the visitor finally spoke, and what came next would shatter any sense of normalcy in the room. "I haven't been outside in 9 years, the young man said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he had been holding the words in for far too long. His tone was distant, as if speaking to no one in particular, but everyone in the room could hear. The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with an unspoken fear. The regulars froze, their curiosity now fully awakened. 9 years. What did he mean? Was he insane? Or was there something darker behind his words? "I have 4 brothers and 1 sister, the man continued, his eyes flicking nervously around the room. They're all still there, in the farm. We need to end it. We need to end their lives. I can't take it anymore." Chris felt a chill run down his spine. The young man's words had a strange weight to them, a gravity that suggested something far more sinister than simple mental illness. The mention of ending lives was enough to make anyone in the small, peaceful cafe sit up and take notice. Before anyone could respond or even process what had been said, the man stood up abruptly. His sudden movement startled the few who were close enough to see, and for a split second Chris caught a glimpse of something. Was it fear in the young man's eyes, or was it something else? Was it regret, a desire for help? The young man's departure was just as abrupt as his arrival. He left the bar without another word, disappearing into the night. Chris stood frozen, his mind racing with questions. Who was he? What did he mean by his cryptic words? And most importantly, was there really something happening at that farm? Something dangerous? As the cafe returned to its quiet atmosphere, the conversation shifted, but the unease lingered. What had just transpired was not something that could be easily forgotten. Chris couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the last he had seen of the strange young man. His cryptic admission had triggered something in Chris, a sense of responsibility, a sense that something far darker was brewing just beyond the town's borders. But at that moment he had no idea how right he was. The next morning, Chris couldn't get the man's words out of his head. He was troubled. He wondered if he should have done anything to intervene, but then again, what could he have done? The man had been so quick to leave. He had spoken with such urgency that Chris knew it wasn't just an empty confession. The weight of the man's words hung over him like a storm cloud. After some deliberation, Chris made the difficult decision. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The young man's warning had to be taken seriously, so he called the local police. The investigation begins. When the police arrived at Chris's cafe, they were skeptical at first. They had heard of the young man, Jan, and his strange behavior, but no one took his ramblings seriously. However, Chris insisted that the man's words were not the ramblings of a drunk, that there was something more to it. And so reluctantly, the officers agreed to investigate. They began by tracing Jan's movements from the night before. The small town of Ruinerwold had very few visitors, and the police had a general idea of who came and went. The strange man had arrived at the cafe and left without much of a trace, but the officers decided to follow up on his statements, curious to know more. The investigation led them to an isolated farm just outside of town on Buitenhuizerweg. It was a place that most of the locals knew, but rarely visited. The farm had always been quiet, almost forgotten in the sweeping green fields that surrounded it. It was the perfect place to disappear to keep a secret. And that's exactly what it seemed to be, a secret. As they approached the farm, a strange unease settled over them. The house looked perfectly ordinary from the outside, but there was something unsettling about the way it stood, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. The police officers exchanged looks, uncertain of what they might find. They knocked, but no one answered. For a moment nothing happened. The world seemed to stand still, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then, with a creak of the old wooden door, it slowly opened, but not by the hands of a welcoming host. This was only the beginning of a mystery far deeper than anyone could have anticipated. The door to the farmhouse creaked open slowly, almost as if it too was reluctant to reveal what lay inside. The police officers exchanged a brief, uncertain glance before stepping across the threshold. The air inside was stale, thick with dust that had accumulated over years of neglect. The farmhouse looked completely abandoned at first glance, but something about it didn't sit right. It felt too quiet. They stepped further inside the floorboards, groaning under their weight, the only sound in the house, the soft shuffle of their boots on the old wood. The house was eerily dark, despite the daylight creeping in through a few cracked windows. The furniture, although worn and ancient, seemed untouched. Dust-covered chairs and a sagging table. The silence was deafening. The officers continued exploring the dim interior, searching for anything that could explain Jan's cryptic warning. It wasn't long before they noticed something strange. There was a room at the back of the house, a small windowless door tucked behind a faded curtain. The officers moved toward it, their nerves slowly fraying. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow, cramped space, what seemed to be a small storage room. The smell that hit them was immediate and overpowering, damp, musty, and oddly sour. It was the smell of something that had been left alone for far too long. As they stepped further inside, they immediately noticed the cluttered old newspapers stacked high in one corner, boxes of forgotten belongings, and a small metal heater rusting in the far corner. But there, in the center of the room, was something that made their hearts skip a beat. A group of people, 6 in total, were sitting huddled together, their faces pale and gaunt. Their clothes were worn and ill-fitting, as though they had not been updated in years. But what struck the officers most was the emptiness in their eyes. There was no joy, no spark of life, just an unsettling, dull stare. The officers froze, their minds racing to piece together what they were seeing. Who were these people? Why were they living in such isolation? The leader of the group, an older man with a thick beard and a weathered face, rose slowly. He had the look of someone who was used to being in control. "You're not supposed to be here," he muttered, his voice low and hoarse. The officers immediately identified him as Gerrit Jan van D., the person they had been searching for after Jan's strange confession at the café. He was the father of the group, though his claim to that title seemed hollow. His eyes flickered with something that could only be described as cold calculation. There was no warmth in them, no recognition of the officer's presence. "Who are these people?" One officer asked, his voice shaking slightly, not entirely sure how to address the situation. "They are my children," Gerrit replied, his tone flat. "All of them." The group in the room, despite their age ranging from what appeared to be teenagers to young adults, had the look of prisoners, as if they had been trapped in time. Their eyes darted nervously at the officers, but none spoke a word. It was as if they had been conditioned to remain silent, to never question their surroundings. The officers questioned them, but none of the young adults spoke freely. They were hesitant, their answers curt and evasive. It became immediately clear that they had been living under some form of oppression, possibly for their entire lives. They had no idea what was happening outside the farmhouse, no idea that the world had moved on without them. They had been cut off from society, as if the world outside the farmhouse was a distant dream. The police were dumbfounded. They had stumbled into a family that seemed to have been living in complete isolation for years, cut off from the world in a way that was almost unimaginable. But why? Why had they stayed there, and why did they look so empty? At that moment, one of the younger women in the group, who appeared to be in her late teens, spoke up. Her voice was soft but firm, and for the first time the officers could see a flicker of life behind her eyes. "We never left," she said, almost as if speaking a truth she had known all her life. "We were told it wasn't safe. We were told that the world was going to end, that we had to stay here." The words hit the officers like a punch to the gut. They had heard whispers of cults and strange beliefs in isolated communities, but this was something else entirely. The family had been kept hidden away from the world, under the guise of some apocalyptic prophecy. It wasn't just isolation, it was indoctrination. In that moment, the officers realized they were dealing with something much bigger than they had anticipated. The family wasn't just isolated, they were trapped. They had been kept in the dark for years by someone who clearly had control over their lives. But who and why? Before they could ask more questions, the older man, Gerrit, spoke again, his voice tinged with a kind of grim finality. "We don't need your help," he said, his hands trembling as he clenched them into fists. "We are safe here. The outside world is dangerous. You don't understand." But the officers weren't going to back down. They had seen enough to know that this wasn't just a family living quietly off the grid. Something darker was at play, and they needed to get to the bottom of it no matter the cost. As they continued to investigate, they uncovered more chilling details. The family had been living under the rule of Gerrit for years, isolated from the rest of the world. Gerrit had used religion and fear to control them, telling them that the outside world was filled with dangers they couldn't even begin to comprehend. They had been taught that the end of the world was imminent, and that only by staying in the farmhouse would they survive. But now it was clear the family's world was no longer the world they had been taught to believe in. Their confinement was a lie, a manipulation by a man who had created his own reality. In the days that followed, the investigation into the family's isolated existence continued. But the more they uncovered, the more questions emerged. How many others had been part of this twisted scheme? Was Garrett alone in his control over the family, or was there someone else behind it all? As the police pieced together the puzzle, the true horror of the situation began to unfold. These people had been trapped in a nightmare, their lives controlled by someone who had taken advantage of their fear and isolation. And yet, despite everything, they had managed to break free, thanks to the mysterious warning of a young man named John. The story of the Ruinerwold family was far from over. It was just beginning. The days that followed the discovery in the farmhouse were a whirlwind of activity. As word spread about the strange family living in isolation for nearly a decade, both the local community and national authorities were left stunned. The media descended upon Ruinerwold like a swarm eager to understand the mystery behind the seemingly ordinary farmhouse and the secrets it held. But while the world's attention focused on the surface-level details, the investigators knew the truth was far deeper than anyone could imagine. They had uncovered the barest fragments of a much larger puzzle, and each discovery seemed to raise more questions than it answered. The first order of business for the police was to separate the family members, some of whom were in their 20s, but others appeared much younger. They needed to determine the extent of their isolation and the influence Garrett had over them. Psychological evaluations were immediately ordered for everyone in the house, and the 6 young adults were taken into protective custody. However, the investigation didn't stop at the farmhouse. The police delved into the background of the man at the center of it all, Garrett Jan Van D. Garrett, a 67-year-old man with a disheveled appearance, had been living in Ruinerwold for much of his life, but very few people in the town actually knew him well. As a private man, he kept to himself, spending most of his days at home or working odd jobs that kept him out of sight. What the townspeople didn't know was that beneath his quiet exterior, Garrett was a man with an extraordinary level of control and manipulation, a man who had systematically isolated his children for years, keeping them locked away from the outside world under the guise of an impending apocalypse. When investigators searched the farmhouse further, they found disturbing evidence that confirmed the severity of Garrett's hold over the family. Documents and journals, many written in Garrett's hand, outlined a bizarre belief system. The man had convinced his children that the world outside was dangerous, that an apocalyptic event was imminent, and that they could only survive by staying in the farmhouse and following his strict rules. These journals were filled with ideas of purification, the importance of seclusion, and frightening interpretations of religious texts. It was clear that Garrett had taken complete control of their lives, shaping their reality to fit his own warped narrative. Among the most chilling discoveries was a detailed record of rituals, so-called cleansing ceremonies, during which the children were subjected to extreme forms of discipline and deprivation. Some of the rituals involved fasting, while others focused on painful physical punishments designed to purge evil from the children's bodies. Many of the victims were left bruised and malnourished. The police learned that these rituals had been a regular part of the children's lives, the culmination of years of manipulation and fear. The police also discovered the extent to which Garrett had kept his family in the dark. He had actively prevented them from interacting with outsiders, going as far as to control their access to basic communication. Phones and internet were forbidden. The family had no access to modern media. Garrett had convinced them that the outside world was filled with danger and sin, a place of corruption that would lead them to eternal damnation if they stepped foot outside. It was clear that these children, now young adults, had been brainwashed. They had been kept in a state of constant fear and isolation, unable to form any independent thoughts or ideas. They had no sense of the passage of time, and their physical and emotional development had been stunted by their lack of exposure to normal societal interactions. But what shocked the investigators even more was the discovery of Jan, the young man who had entered the Café and sparked the investigation in the first place. Jan's story was a tale of quiet rebellion, of a man who had been the first to question his father's teachings and to seek out the world beyond the farmhouse walls. His visit to the café, his cryptic statements about his family, and his desperate need for help marked the breaking point in the family's long history of captivity. Jan, it turned out, had been the eldest son, raised to inherit Garrett's authority, but as he grew older, he began to sense that something was wrong. He realized that his father's warnings about the outside world were nothing more than lies designed to keep them all under control. Over time, Jan had started to question the teachings and to make plans to escape. It was Jan's courage, his willingness to defy his father, that had eventually led to the family's discovery. Though Jan's escape from the farmhouse was far from easy, he had succeeded in reaching the outside world and had made his way to the café, where he had ultimately confided in Chris Westerbeek, the café owner. When the police finally managed to interview Jan in detail, they learned the full scope of his efforts. For years he had tried to make contact with the outside world, writing letters to distant relatives, but Garrett had intercepted and destroyed them. Jan's courage in the face of his father's authoritarian control was extraordinary, yet his decision to speak out had come at a steep personal cost. He had never seen the world outside the farmhouse, never known the freedom that many people take for granted, and yet he had risked everything to help free his family. The emotional toll of his years in captivity was evident when he finally opened up to the authorities, but his confession about what had happened inside the farmhouse was invaluable to the investigation. One detail that struck investigators the most was the chillingly cult-like nature of Garrett's control. It wasn't just isolation that kept the children under Garrett's power. It was the belief system he created, a belief system so consuming that it became the lens through which they saw everything. They were told that everything they knew, from their emotions to their bodies, was impure and needed to be cleansed. They were taught to reject the world outside and to embrace the authority of their father as a divine figure. The more the investigators uncovered, the more they realized that Garrett Jan Van D wasn't just an isolated, eccentric man. He was the leader of a dangerous psychological manipulation operation that extended far beyond his family. And as they learned more about the details of his twisted beliefs, they couldn't help but wonder how many others might have fallen victim to similar schemes, how many others might still be trapped, hidden away under the guise of protection. As the investigation expanded, it was becoming clear that the story of the Van D family was just one chapter in a much darker narrative, a narrative that reached far beyond the sleepy town of Ruinerwold. The police had only begun to uncover the depths of Garrett's control, and they knew that the real challenge had only just begun. As the investigation into the Van D family deepened, new and shocking revelations began to surface, painting an even darker picture of the years spent in isolation. The more the police dug into Garrett Jan Van D's past, the more it became apparent that his manipulation wasn't merely the result of a few odd beliefs. It was a systematic, calculated effort to control and dominate every aspect of his children's lives. One of the most unsettling findings was a series of old photographs that the investigators discovered hidden away in one of the farmhouse's back rooms. These photographs, dating back to when the children were very young, told a horrifying story. The images showed a family living together in seclusion, but there was something strange in every frame. The children's expressions were unnervingly vacant, their faces marked by a sense of fear or confusion that should never have been present in a child. These pictures were far from nostalgic mementos. They were records of a childhood lost, stolen by a man who sought to shape his family's existence into something unrecognizable. The children were rarely allowed to leave the house, and when they did, it was under strict supervision. Garrett's obsession with control had extended even to their physical appearances. Each child had been made to wear identical plain clothes, so they could not stand out in any way. Psychological evaluation of the children revealed a disturbing reality. While they had been kept isolated for most of their lives, the trauma they had suffered wasn't just physical, it was mental and emotional. The experts explained that such extreme levels of control, coupled with isolation, often led to Stockholm Syndrome, a condition where the victims begin to form emotional attachments to their abuser. What was most chilling, however, was what they uncovered about Garrett's relationship with his children. As it turned out, Garrett had cultivated an atmosphere of fear so profound that the children had come to believe that anything beyond their father's reach was dangerous. His teachings had seeped into every corner of their world, and to them his actions were justified by a twisted sense of divine authority. But the truth about the cult-like behavior didn't end there. In interviews with locals, it was revealed that several townspeople had reported seeing Garrett and his children during rare forays outside the farmhouse. Strangely, the family had always acted unusually detached from reality, socially awkward and intensely wary of strangers. Many of the townsfolk had dismissed the family's eccentricities, chalking it up to them being quiet, but those small moments of contact now seemed far more sinister. It was clear that Garrett's influence extended far beyond just his immediate family. His reach had touched every aspect of the community, whether intentionally or not. Yet the most haunting realization came when the authorities discovered how many others had unknowingly been exposed to Garrett's ideology. His grip on reality and his ability to weave a narrative of fear and isolation had gone unnoticed for years. As the investigation expanded, the true scale of his manipulation began to sink in, and the authorities couldn't shake the growing fear who else was living in the shadow of such twisted control. In the heart of the small town of Ruinerwold, a deep sense of unease settled in. No one could have ever imagined that the quiet, secluded farmhouse on Buitenhuizerweg had been hiding such an unimaginable secret for nearly a decade. What had been a peaceful village where everyone knew, everyone was now revealed to have harbored darkness right under their noses. As the investigation into the Van D family progressed, more and more hidden details began to emerge, revealing a labyrinth of lies, manipulation, and deceit that had been carefully constructed over the years. The authorities soon realized that the true extent of Garrett Jan Van D's control over his children was far more pervasive than they had initially thought. It wasn't just about keeping them in isolation, it was about erasing their past, their identities, and everything that could potentially threaten his authority. The first major shock came when the police uncovered official records that indicated several discrepancies regarding the family's true identity. Although they had lived in Ruinerwold for nearly a decade, there were no official registrations or birth certificates for the children. This led to the chilling discovery that Garrett had effectively hidden his children's existence from the authorities. They had never attended school, never been registered in any official capacity, and most disturbingly, they had never seen the outside world in any meaningful way. Investigators discovered that Garrett had carefully fabricated an entire life for himself and his family, carefully hiding them from public scrutiny. He had convinced the children that they were part of a divine plan, a chosen family whose duty was to remain secluded, untouched by the corrupt outside world. Garrett claimed that the outside world was full of evil and sin, and that their only salvation lay in their complete isolation. This idea was reinforced by the fact that Garrett had maintained a tight control over every aspect of their lives, including what they ate, how they dressed, and even the limited education they received. What was even more unsettling was the realization that Garrett had created a warped version of religion and spirituality that served as the foundation for his rule. Over the years, he had instilled in his children the belief that they were living in the final days of the world, and that they were the last true believers left. Any contact with outsiders was considered dangerous, even forbidden. Garrett had convinced his children that if they ever left the farm, they would be tainted by the evil forces of the world. One of the most haunting aspects of Garrett's twisted worldview was his belief in purification. He regularly subjected his children to brutal punishments, both physical and psychological, to purify them from any thoughts or behaviors that he deemed inappropriate. The authorities discovered that the children had been subjected to harsh physical punishments, often for the smallest of infractions. They were forced to kneel for hours in uncomfortable positions, deprived of food and water, and even made to stand outside in the cold as punishment for something as trivial as speaking out of turn. The police also uncovered diaries and journals written by Garrett which chronicled his obsessive control over his family. These documents revealed just how deep his delusions had run. Garrett had convinced himself that he was on a divine mission to protect his children from the corrupt world outside, and his journal entries revealed his growing paranoia and obsession with maintaining control. In his mind, the children were not only his responsibility, they were his property, and their sole purpose was to serve him and uphold his beliefs. It was during the questioning of Jan, the young man who had first stumbled into De Castelline, that investigators learned even more disturbing details about the family's life inside the farmhouse. John, who had been the one to break the silence, revealed in a series of tearful confessions that he had never known anything beyond the confines of the farm. He spoke of the extreme isolation and the relentless indoctrination he and his siblings had suffered. Jan, who had been the eldest, had taken it upon himself to help his younger siblings escape the psychological prison they were trapped in, but his attempts were often thwarted by Garrett's constant surveillance. Jan's recollections were chilling as he described the mind games Garrett played on his children. Garrett would often gaslight them, telling them that they were ungrateful and sinful for even questioning the life they had been given. The children were taught to fear their own thoughts, to suppress their feelings, and to blindly obey their father. Jan had been the first to break free from this cycle, but it had taken him 9 years to muster the courage to leave. He had only ventured into the outside world once, and it was that fateful trip to De Castelline that would lead to the unraveling of the family's dark secret. During his interviews with investigators, Jan admitted that the fear of what awaited him back at the farmhouse had almost stopped him from speaking out. He was terrified of what would happen if his father found out that he had left. But the more Jan spoke, the clearer it became that he was desperate to free not only himself, but also his siblings. He had been the first to recognize that what he had lived through wasn't normal. It wasn't just isolation, it was abuse, manipulation, and control. As the investigation unfolded, Garrett's influence seemed to extend even further than anyone had anticipated. The authorities uncovered a network of contacts and associates who had enabled his family's isolation. Garrett had found ways to keep his children off the radar, utilizing various means to avoid detection. His ability to manipulate the system and his tight-knit network allowed him to keep his family in the shadows for years, undisturbed by the outside world. But as the truth began to surface, it became clear that Jan's escape had been the first crack in the wall of silence that had surrounded the Van D family for so long. The discovery of the family's existence and the horrifying reality of their abuse sent shockwaves through the small town of Ruinerwold. What had once been a quiet, unassuming village now found itself at the heart of a chilling and complex case of parental control, isolation, and psychological torment. The police, still reeling from the scale of the discovery, worked tirelessly to piece together the full extent of Garrett's manipulation and to ensure that his children received the care they needed. But questions still lingered. How had Garrett managed to maintain such tight control over his family for so long? What had made the authorities and the community so blind to the signs of abuse? And perhaps most troubling of all, how many other families in Ruinerwold or beyond were living in similar conditions, trapped by the grip of one man's delusions? As the investigation moved forward, it was clear that the Van D family's story was just the beginning. The truth, like the layers of an onion, was still being peeled back, revealing more and more terrifying details about the world Garrett had built, a world where fear ruled and love had no place.